1.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Digital Futures Dr. Consortium. We just finished the fellow meeting of Digital Futures 7 minutes ago. So every year, all the fellows of Digital Futures will have a special meeting. And this year, we nominate two important professors, Professor Maria Kappel and also Professor Patrick Schumacher. And it's a great honor for me to announce we have two more fellows of the community. Based on the past contribution to Digital Futures, I think all the important figure people here contribute a lot. They play a very important role, not only in the academic research, but also I think the educating and sharing their knowledge to the digital in architecture community. So Patrick, congrats. We will announce it formally in the closing ceremony of the workshops on July the 3rd, I think this weekend. And today, I think Patrick will give us the third lecture. The topic is architectural autopoiesis within the functionally differentiate society. I think the keywords, as Patrick mentioned on the right top, including communication structures, a discourse analysis of the discipline, openness through closure, media codes and programs. Elementary operation of architecture, design decisions, network dependency of elemental operations, design decisions and external demands, form versus function as architecture lead distinction, internal versus external. I think yesterday Patrick also mentioned a lot about that. And then last but not least is about utility and the beauty as a double code of architecture design. So let's welcome, screen is yours, Patrick.
Yeah, welcome everybody again to installment 3 of the lecture series. I'm enjoying this so far. I hope we have a good session this time as well. I had some really good Q&A, I think, challenging questions at the end. So again, I will talk for up to an hour. Then I hope we're going into a Q&A based on what I've been presenting, or it is also in generally open up to what worries people about my positions or things that remain unclear also from the last 2 lectures, or from in general impression of my approach. So all of that will be opened up. So I will share my screen. So yeah, lecture 3, architectural autopoiesis with functionally differentiated society. And let me start by talking about this notion of the autopoiesis within which rings this notion of autonomy. And the way Luhmann talks about these systems of communications, which are the great professions, but they are discourses as well, and communities of practice. He's talking about them through the concept of self-referential closure. But at the same time, there is a notion of openness through closure. So this closure is not meant a shutting itself down with respect to the societal environment and its demands. It just means an autonomous engagement with these demands, i.e. the demands are confronting the field, but how to respond to, adapt to, and deliver towards these demands is a task which is defined, discussed, resolved within that self-enclosed self-driving discourse. So we're not getting instructions from outside, we're getting challenges and problems posed to us from the outside, but the solution cannot be imposed. I mean, sometimes that has been tried, and that spells simply the end of the discourse and independence of architecture. And that's something which has always been moments of regressiveness in the field. So actually, the big example of that was the fantastic flourishing and explosion of, let's say, the discourse of architecture in the 1920s in Germany in particular, modernism, but it also, moved on to, France, obviously, Switzerland, and any other Central European countries were involved. And in the 30s, it also started to compass Britain and the United States of America. I call that the refundation of the discipline of architecture, the Autopoiesis of architecture in the 1920s. So, this was basically shut down by Hitler and the Nazi Party basically taking over, meaning that they were in the business of imposing solutions. And that means obviously the end of architecture as we know it. And that's why it's important, because I said earlier, of course, there's still the buildings were built, but I don't think that these buildings belong to architecture, and they're not referred to, and they're not recorded in the history of architecture. And they were not, the protagonists were not members of the community, world community of architects. So that's the issue. What I mean by self-referential closure with respect to elaborating solutions, but total openness with respect to receiving challenges and problems, and then solving those problems into the built environment, but on the terms of an expert discourse, which has a long also gestation and evolution, where the thinking mechanisms, what I call the communication structures and categories through which the field absorbs issues and problems and develops solutions, these obviously have evolved over centuries. And there is this across many authors. And of course, it's interesting also that in the idea of architecture is that it is a system of communication. In this sense, it is bottom up. It is a process, but it's quite different from the vernacular, in the sense that we do have that all the contributions are contributions of authors taking responsibility for taking a position of generating an original contribution, opening themselves to critique, but also standing their ground with arguments. And of course, that disappears once the political branch takes over. There's only one author, basically, Adolf Hitler. And the same happened in the Soviet Union. You have this incredible flourishing of the early Soviet discourse through obviously fantastic people, like also integrating with the art movements, with Malevich, Elisitsky, the Vutimas as a pendant to the Bauhaus, Leonidov, Chernikov, etc. These key authors, theorists like Mose Ginsberg I mentioned last time. And basically the autonomy is that this kind of swarm intelligent and discourse, but where the elements of the swarm are recognizable authors, by the way, but still nobody is determining, even though they're influential key figures like Le Corbusier, he is maybe sending an influence in debates with many interlocutors. So that's all shut down by Stalin, where in the end there is no authorship, no architecture, no discourse, and therefore Stalinist building isn't architecture. Anyway, so So that's just to because this idea of autonomy, the way I understand, is very different from Eisenman. This idea of self-referential closure of an autopoiesis is often misunderstood as something where we shut ourselves up and avoid external challenges and influences or problems, and we become this kind of, in the Eisenman terms, the autonomy is the la pour la, which severs all, which denies all responsibility for progressing the built environment of society. So that's very, very different approach and concept of autonomy. So here is, so we have that program to go through. I don't want to read it out. Philip just read it out. And so if we have that autopoietic discourse, it has what I call communication structures. That means basically key categories, key schemata of how to argue for a design. It has systems of values. It has criteria of beauty and functionality, so which condense into something like a style. So a style is a communication structure and the point of reference within the autopoiesis of architecture. And what is interesting that in terms of the basic schemata and categories, there's a persistence across centuries of what, and also certain what I'm going to come later to, the codes, for instance, functional, dysfunctional. These are binary codes, evaluative codes, beautiful, ugly, formal resolved, formally unresolved. These are all communication structures. We can call it also, key categories, tropes, schemata for argumentation. And in Luhmann's terms, these are communication structures of systems of communications. That's his terminology, which I'm picking up on, but also it's worth mentioning that, let's say, in the French post-structuralist philosophy and theory, we find something very similar being pointed to, namely discourses or epistemes in Foucauldian terms, and the idea of a discourse analysis, a representation of those underlying fundamental categories that structure the discourse, the structures of discourse, which you tease out in a discourse analysis. And I will go into that, obviously, to some extent today, and also for the remainders of the lecture. So these, and what is important to know that what I'm attempting to do here is not only give a description of those discursive structures, but I'm also trying to rationalize them, critique them, or basically explain why they are justified. So as I said yesterday, retrospectively, it's more of a justification and explanation, but then also there's contested ground looking forward. So yeah, openness through closure. Anyway, so the other thing which is important to recognize, just stepping back one moment before we enter the discourse analysis, that architectural theory, so the architectural theoretician obviously has to be fully embedded within the discourse of architecture. We're not external observers. We are enmeshed within the practice of architecture through critique, commentary, and oftentimes you'll find obviously that there's many of the key and potent protagonists of architectural theory were actually themselves also practicing architects, starting with Alberti, and the same goes for Serlio, Palladio, people like Gottfried Semper as well, which I mentioned yesterday, even a Durand, and of course the Corbusier, and on we go with Venturi, Rem Koolhaas, etc. But of course there have also been theorists who have been, and that's a more recent phenomenon, where there's a division of labor between practicing architects and theorists. But that's, I think there's three categories: practicing architects without developing a lot of theory, but of course living off and talking through through the voices which they receive of their surrounding milieu of theorists, then the double protagonists, and then those who are theorists only, but they embed themselves into the discipline of architecture. Only then they can be really fruitful. Key examples in the history of architecture would be somebody like Siegfried Gideon, who was at least, he was embedded in the field of architecture. He was one of the organizers of the SIAM congresses. And he was obviously, he was closely in contact with many key figures and joined conferences, with the key figures of the era, Mies and Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, Le Corbusier, etc. And we have Adolf Behn in the 1920s. Mose Ginsburg was mentioned, but he was also, by the way, a designer too. And obviously we do have, and we respect obviously those theorists, for instance, Mario Capo is here, Neil Leach, who are deeply embedded in the architectural discourse through teaching, through guiding and critiquing design, and being always with architects, understanding how architects work, talk, critique, progress their designs. It's very, very important. So anyway, so that being said, but what is in particular with the architectural theorist has to do, he can't live only within the discipline of architecture. I think if you want to be an innovative theorist, we need to also look beyond. I mean, everybody does to some extent, but systematically, I would say a leader of the field in terms of architectural theories, he might also be a practitioner, needs to look beyond and needs to, for instance, embed architectural theory in the theory of society, needs to start reading basically philosophy, which is the general, to update the field with respect to very general forms of argument, to realize that some older ways of arguing and older premises have been rejected as simplistic and naive. So, as well as learning obviously new ways of new additional turns of reflection, which have to be built into it, so that you find in philosophy. But more than that, you need to have specific theory of society understanding, so a specific social science branches and theories. So the theory of socioeconomic development, which I've looked at a lot. I mean, the general framework of the theory of society, which I'm referring to Luhmann, but I've obviously looked at many other works and protagonists. You have to have a theory of socioeconomic development, in particular something which is beyond Luhmann. I'm very much aligning with the discourse, post-Fordism discourse, so from Fordism to post-Fordism, the socioeconomic development, also from socialism to neoliberalism, or from the social democracy to neoliberalism, these political transformations. A lot, I think, was quite important is also business organization theory, which I looked at network organization, self-organization in the business world, is of particular importance, because that's what impacts a lot the way society functions and produces. Our ways of life depend a lot on our working lives. But also we're looking at the human social sciences, so psychology of perception I've been looking at, particularly Gestalt psychology, semiology. The semiological project learns a lot from linguistics, a source of domain of phonological transference. So building a semiological project, and also learning from other sciences with respect to agent-based life process modeling, etc. Spatio-mathematical sciences for the organizational project, network theory, I mean graph theory, etc. So that is generally what I think what protagonists and innovators would look outside to see whether new tendencies which have been discovered in other domains need to be imported. There needs to be technology transfer, and that's not happening on many levels. Currently, it happens on that the technology transfers from the gaming industry into let's say simulation and also metaverse design. Anyway, so that's very important. So and in particular emphasizing this. Philosophy is often more of the inspirational side, but we have to absorb a lot of sciences. We have to look beyond architecture to inform architecture with respect to the resources it brings to bear. But of course, we have to keen observers of the societal environment. I mean, that's brought to us through clients, but we should not only wait until clients knock on our door demanding things we can't answer, but we need to have a foresight and see what's coming. What are the social societal developments which are coming? Okay, so because we are basically a key contributor to the development of the built environment, and we need to ask ourselves, what is actually the key contribution the built environment does towards society, since we're involved in that? And that is what I call, you need to realize it's the ordering of social processes. Much more than physical shelter and protection against elements and beasts, etc. That's not the key thing. I mean, that was maybe at the beginning, but very soon into building human societies, the ordering capacity of structuring, differentiating groups, as well as activities, and to network them, etc. These are ordered social processes, and they can only happen at a certain scale if there's a material substrate which gives structure to these processes, and then that allows them to grow. And if you look at concentric city growth, we need that material substrate, the built environment, and this is before architecture arrives as a conscious discipline. The built environment already has that evolved, that material substrate, basically the DNA that persists and only slowly and reproduces and only slowly accrues mutations, is the substrate which makes cultural evolution possible, and it makes the buildup of more complex societies which go beyond 50, let's say, primates into hundreds and thousands of human beings, because then there's groups of these villages gathered around in a etc. etc. So what I'm saying here, that's the base insight, and liberation of an artificial built environment is a necessary condition for the buildup of any social order. The social process needs the built environment as a plane of inscription to build up and stabilize social structures at any stage, which in turn allow the further evaluation of more complex social processes. They can be gradually growing and accruing, even below the level of conscious grasping. I mean, that's a natural growth process, an evolutionary process which doesn't have at that point a lot of consciousness. It's not, these are not planned settlement. They're evolved and accruing and elaborating, and they build up complexity over time through this kind of process of mutation, selection, reproduction. Okay, so that's the background condition, and obviously at some point, and I mentioned earlier, that's basically only fully fledged in the Renaissance. What was this very unplanned, gradual accrual process becomes a conscious design process. I mean, not that all cities since then have been designed, but there's a lot of examples, and the attempt was made to draw up the ideal city, to draw up a full central plaza with series of key buildings in that ideal city. And then also you have a lot of these colonial, grids and foundations of new cities under the, there was opportunities like that both within Italy as well as when we had starting the process of colonization. So we do have the architecture picking that up and making it a conscious process, but I mean not fully. I mean, the forces which drive built environments in terms of the overall structure, there's still a lot of bottom-up processes, and I defend that, and that's a discussion we had at the end of yesterday. But basically, the underlying function and role of the built environment remains very potent, namely the ordering of social processes on ever larger scales of integration into total metropolitan environments or networks of cities, maybe connected with portals like airports, etc., etc. So, and now I'm getting a little bit into the social theory, in which the Autopoiesis of architecture as a comprehensive unified theory of architecture fits into the overall theory of society. Now, I was thinking and looking around, you know, where one could find a comprehensive theoretical project with respect to society, its history, evolution, and forward drive. And I mean, in the 1980s and early 90s, I was a Marxist. I was looking at Marxism. It's a Marxist approach, because that's quite a comprehensive theory of society with particular set of categories of importance. Some of them are still important to me, and they also have been migrating into more general sociological theories. But I was shifting away from that, you know, obviously when the socialist blocs collapsed, and when I also learned to get excited about the new post-Fordist dynamics, even out of Marxism, within Marxism, there was a lot of, let's say, innovation and transformation. And I looked around where I can find a more robust and more updated theory of society and of social processes that would be sophisticated and would have integrated many of the historical lessons since. And I looked around, I was looking at, I've been reading a lot of the works of Jürgen Habermas, another major German philosopher sociologist. But in the end, I went for Luhmann. And again, as an architectural theorist, it's hard to redo all of social theories. Then you switch careers. You think that there's nothing you can build upon, no state of the art, no kind of frontier of social theory building, which absorbs a lot of features and has a good grasp and good description of the contemporary societal conditions. Then you think you have to redo all of it yourself. Well, say goodbye to architectural theory. There's going to be a lifelong project right there. So no, I mean, that can't be expected of an architectural theorist. What we have to expect from an architectural theorist is that he identifies, that he's scanning the literature, he's looking out for theory of society, socioeconomic theories, etc., and somehow takes from there the premises within which architecture can be embedded. And I think I was quite impressed with the work of Niklas Luhmann, and it's an incredibly impressive achievement, which really has, over a big apparatus of keystone publications which systematize the totality of sociology, for instance, and the phenomena of social interaction on one hand, then has a series of monographic treatments of, for instance, the political system, the economic system, the legal system, the system of the arts, the system of the media, the system of the mass media in this case, so the education system, etc. So, and then he has another 2-volume keystone summary in terms of theory of society, which encompasses all of that. And then in parallel, he's run a series of books on analyzing what he calls the semantic structures, meaning the ideologies and discourses and categories, some kind of a discourse analysis of the various societal relevant theories, and that's been very important as well. So I don't think there's anybody else who can stand in and compete with the comprehensiveness, the rigor, and also absorbing a lot of the latest philosophical trends to make sure that there's that this new system isn't vulnerable to let's say, to deconstruction, like a lot of previous simplistic theories were. So that's where I found, and I really got into it and worked and read through the totality of the oeuvre, and I realized that this is not only exciting in its own right, but there's so much which phenomena he's describing, which we also find in the way architectural discourse has developed. So basically, to summarize what he's developing, first of all, he is focusing on understanding societal interactions as communications. But this is a very, very broad concept. So communications are not only speech acts, but they're also, of course, bodily gestures, but they're more than that. They include, for Luhmann, of course, books, magazine articles, lectures, but also visual communications, but also, everything which happens in decisions, these are communications. When a parliament makes a decision and communicates that decision, when a judge makes a decision, these are all communications. When in the economy, you communicate with words, but you communicate with money when you complete a transaction. And so that is encompassed under the concept of communication, because there is that element of understanding and this element of a linguistic underpinning in all of these human interactions. I think that's something which sociology had elaborated and understood, and the great sociologists of the 20th century before Luhmann was a very important figure in American sociology, basically founding sociology in America and became a towering figure from several decades. Talcott Parsons is the great systematic sociologist and theory builder. That's where Luhmann picks up on. Luhmann was actually a student of Parsons in Harvard. Luhmann went to Harvard to study with, Luhmann was already a very sophisticated figure. He just, selected Parsons to engage with. And then he came back. And what was also very important with respect to Luhmann's work is that he is integrating, bringing into the humanities and social sciences the whole world of complexity theory, which was evolving, and where Parsons was already the first sociologist starting that. So communicating directly with the Macy conferences and with figures like the cybernetics, and then particular second order cybernetics, complexity theory of self-organization, of self-regulation, all of that is coming into sociology initially through Parsons, but much more prominently in a much more sophisticated level with Niklas Luhmann. So, and that was an important element because that happened within architecture too. So architecture got, realized the potency and insights coming out of complexity theory. And of course, it is also, then we could actually work with insights and from complexity theory because we started to engage in computational tooling up computationally. And I heard that John Fraser is, talking later, but that the AA, and I think Fraser was a student of, Gordon Pask. So Gordon Pask was the key British cyberneticist, second order cybernetics. He was teaching ended up at the AA teaching, and you have somebody like Ronald Granville, who who studied both architecture at the AA and computer science at the Imperial, and became a key figure in the second order cybernetics discourse. And these are figures which Luhmann was very familiar with and highly appreciative of. So we find that intersection. So that's some kind of ground prepared also, which I think with congeniality with respect to Luhmann's choosing Luhmann, but also you could have maybe chosen. I don't want to make this, it's important that this isn't an arbitrary choice. And I think one could have also done a lot of good for architecture if one had chosen, for instance, if I had chosen Jürgen Habermas, because there's a lot of overlap. It's also sociology as communication theory, the theory of communicative action. And he learned, they were in dialogue, he was in dialogue with Luhmann for decades. He learned a lot and absorbed a lot of Luhmann's insights, some different foci, a more political activist focus, Luhmann more the descriptive focus. So I could have gone here, I could have gone to Anthony Giddens, who, and again, in that dialogue, the theory of structuration, many similar insights. So it is, you know, maybe the details would have been a little different and the emphases, but if I don't think, you know, it's first of all not arbitrary to go with Luhmann. It's certainly, if you compare his work with Giddens, it's kind of maybe 3 times of comprehensive. And in terms of also the influence of Luhmann, you know, unfortunately, he's a German speaker and these things getting translated a bit later. He was also teaching at Stanford. Is still spreading. And in Germany, what you found is he's dominated the scene so much, he actually overpowered the much more globally famous Habermas inside Germany in the sociology world. He basically won that, let's say, battle of the titans. And you do find what I've always ever witnessed before with Marx, these kind of, let's say, Marxism and capital reading groups and community, as it were, news groups or discussion groups. They have been organized around Luhmann. Why? Because of the fascinating density, complexity, and scale of the project, which invites this, you know. So trust me, it's, you know, both it's a good choice, but if you say it should have been a different choice, probably very many similar insights would have come through, also through a Habermas, through a Giddens, maybe through, you know, I mean, I was mentioning DeLanda. You can basically, a lot of the insights coming through with DeLanda, but obviously DeLanda's work is, let's say, is maybe a 5% of Luhmann's work when it comes to social theory. So, but somebody having a go at using DeLanda, why not? Okay, so basically, if you buy into that argument that it's and first of all, that it's a good way to just take an edifice and then plug into that, makes a lot of sense. Cumulative, you know, a certain past dependency. You know, Marxism was the example where you would, you know, and I think I was hoping, and I think that Luhmann could have this kind of following, spreading out and disseminating. So anyway, let me go into it. So basically, he also has a grand scheme of historical periodization with respect to stages of societal development, similar to Marx and others. So Marx obviously had the key things like slaveholding, I mean, primitive communism or clan society, then into a slaveholding society, into feudalism, into capitalism, and then the outlook of socialism into communism. So, and there's a parallel here. So what Luhmann is talking about, and Marx is talking about modes of production as a key concept and criteria. You look at the drivers, you looked at different modes of production. So feudalism is a different mode of production than the capitalist mode of production. Luhmann is going for modes of societal differentiation. So social differentiation and societal differentiation. And each era, each epoch in societal development, you will find a dominant mode of social and societal differentiation. So the first one, if you look at, and that would be the equivalent of hunter and gatherer conditions or clan structured, what before you have the big civilization, you have segmentation, segmentary differentiation. Basically, the way the society grows, it just generates more small villages, more small tribal groups. they can't aggregate much. And they're all similar and the same. It's quite flat. There's no hierarchy, no overall structure. I mean, they communicate, maybe they have some sporadic trade with each other. They, for purposes of defense, maybe sometimes they come together. And that's why they're potentially building a very soft hierarchy. But usually there's very little hierarchy. Also within the tribe, there's just, it consists of families who are more or less equal. Anyway, so that's the first mode of differentiation. And we still have that. And you still have these kind of parallel multiplication of on the same level of similar units. For instance, in a company, there are various departments and you generate new departments, although they're not just next to each other, they're integrated. The next stage was the center periphery differentiation, where you have societies where some of these, let's say, villages or tribes become have central functions, mostly around defense and warfare, for instance. Or you have also a settlement. One of the villages becomes bigger and accrues some additional functions for, you know, meeting and gathering or marketplaces, etc. So that's center periphery. And the big one, which then emerges, which you find in all the great civilizations, in terms of you know what Marx called also the big Asian despotic or slaveholding societies, which also include, of course, Greek, ancient Greece, Roman Empire, and Persian Empire. All of these were what Luhmann would call stratified orders. So stratification becomes the primary mode of differentiation, and that is lasted very, very long in the West as well. And of course, in China you have that as well, and in India very strong with the caste system. But also in Europe, these stratifications, they became very, very late, many layers. So it's not only that you have the gentry or the nobility and the commoners. These were two primary categories, and the clergy as a third category coming in. But within the nobility, you had many different layers, and then the high sensitivity to where you are in the layer. And that's the only in primary ordering principle, this kind of hierarchy, and that would cut through all levels of life. So if you were in the higher rank in the system of stratification, you had the privilege with respect to everything. Any encounter would be asymmetric, and you would always be the one to speak, the other one to listen. You would, you know, the landlord could make decisions across all domains of life, invading. There was no private life as such. In any case, you could also, you know, sleep with the you know, have the first night with every married woman, for instance. Also, when it came to warfare, when it came to economic relations, and there was a high sensitivity to stratification. So that persisted very, very long and overlapped along with what the next stage was, with when functional differentiation emerged gradually, basically under the heading of modernity, which commences maybe in the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, etc. You have functional differentiation, but of course the stratification remains quite dominant for many further centuries. And we still have, obviously, the other thing which we realized, that while stratification was operating, you still have center periphery and you still have segmentation. In each of the strata, there is segmentary proliferation of units, but they're always locked into these hierarchies. Even the family itself was strongly stratified, with the patriarch being in charge, etc. So anyway, so functional differentiation is the big thing of modernity, and that still is dominating contemporary society. But the trajectory of where functional differentiation becomes ever more dominant, that's the history of an ever more, you know, evolving modernity into modern functionally differentiated society, where the functional differentiation is very, very important, and functionally to do with division of labor and competencies, which are no longer ordered hierarchically. And it shows up when you have, you know, when people queuing up at the bus, they don't care if you're a nobleman or a commoner. You just join the queue, or in a company, you have maybe a CEO and you have a local receptionist or cleaner. They have their own domain of competency in which they rule supreme, and the CEO isn't interfering with the receptionist or with the cleaner, and it actually has to move out of the way when the cleaner has to clean the floor. So that's functional differentiation. But the more important part is here that the functional differentiation means that there's a much higher level of complexity can achieve, because we can differentiate out domains of social ordering. So we can differentiate out the economy becoming independent, autonomous domain from the political authority and system, as well as the legal system becoming autonomous. And before, this was all integrated in the pyramid, where the rulers and nobility, they were in charge of political decisions. They were undifferentiated even from economic decisions and economic dominance, as well as they were in charge of the law, and they were treated differently by the law, even if as the legal system generated some degree of independence. There wasn't equality before the law. There wasn't an independent judiciary, which is now the part of a, you know, so functional differentiation shows up also in governance systems where you have the division of powers between, for instance, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, for instance, etc., etc. But most importantly, and now I'm coming to this, we find that various aspects of society differentiated out, and these are what Luhmann calls the great function systems. So functional differentiation it exists on many levels, in small groups where you start to have a division of labor, who's doing what, who's in charge of what. In corporate structures, you have all these demands of competencies, which are not hierarchically structured, but they're equally, there's just division of labor, and somebody has the right and competence to do X, Y, Z. Within each department, there's hierarchies, but between the departments, there's relations of functional differentiation, which are not stratified. So, but the big things is now society-wide function systems. And so politics, the political process, the political system is separated out for a particular function, just to organize collectively binding decisions where you have collective action requirements. And that is separate from the law, the legal processes where it's about dispute resolution, and also the development of, you know, for instance, through judge-made extrapolations and development of the law and common law, separated out totally from the economy, where you have a lot of independent actors and independent processes. In particular, for instance, science, the liberation of science. Before, science was totally controlled by this, in that stratification from the top of the pyramid. They were in charge of having a unified description of society, which they dictated, and science wasn't tolerated, right? So you have the Inquisition cutting and preventing knowledge to be generated in a separate system. I mean, that started to emerge, and there was a major conflict over centuries, or 2-3 centuries, with politics had to realize that it has no say over scientific truth. And similarly, the education system evolved, separating out from the family processes, health system, mass media system, the art system. So we have these great function systems of society. And what's important about them is that each of these, they have their own guiding societal function task, which they relate to. And there's only one function system to address them. There's only one economy. And each of these systems, they are both systems of action, through communication, but they're also discourses of reflection. So each of these systems has its own set of categories, criteria, success, agendas, evaluation, aspects of the world they look at, and they're quite different aspects of the world they're in charge of and they're looking at, and the other aspect is left to the other function systems. So they depend on the other aspects being covered by the other function systems. So they have this degree of autonomy I was talking about earlier. They have that, they're autopoietic, self-referentially closed systems that develop their own categories and their own ways of solving issues which society brings to the table, as it were. For instance, collective action issues which need to be resolved, certain decisions which the political system will have to be resolved. They will do that within the political system. You know, political parties, politicians, parliamentary processes, subcommittees, that's where you discuss and decide. Yes, there is, at one point, there is this kind of validation at every 4 years. There's some kind of voting and also some observation of popularity and polling, but these are external perturbation inputs. The actual decision-making process, the communication is basically self-referentially closed. Yes, it is reported in the media, but if you want to join, you really have to become a politician. You have to join a political party. You have to then maybe also join, you know, head a ministry, etc., and where you become impactful. So similarly, the economy obviously has its own categories. So the legal system is under the spell of this distinction between legal, illegal, what's an issue of law, which is quite different from an issue of scientific truth, which is quite different from an issue of you know, political positioning. These are highly separate, and they're distilled out through the discourse as nearly incommensurable questions, right? Where they can't pollute each other. You can't interfere with each other. Issues of political power and majority position don't come into play when you have a court process deciding on a case. That's not about, you know, who has more supporters and who has more voters. That's an internal process which looks at precedents, statutes, etc., and has its own discourse and doctrines and cases and paradigms, and there are also, of course, sometimes different approaches which are contesting, and that's the kind of the theoretical level. So each of these function systems also have whole theoretical reflection series, as Luhmann calls it. They have, you know, whole literatures across centuries. And I'm basically, my point here was that Luhmann has, I mean, this is not an absolute finite and complete list. I think there's, and you know, there could emerge additional function system. I think one function system which I see in being in the state of emergence, as you have here, health and medicine. I think there is mental health and counseling and life coaching, which is quite different from a medical paradigm, and which starts to be something which we all in America already, nearly everybody who in our complex lives is kind of referring to and looking for. They have their own categories, paradigms, and ways of working. Speech therapy, not medication. That could be coming in, but the big one he's missed out on is architecture, because Luhmann wasn't an avid reader of and connoisseur and knowledge about architecture. He packed that, and that's he packed that into art, which is a very, very traditional way of looking at it. He had in the art system, he had architecture, painting, sculpture, etc., etc. So I think he missed out on architecture, and I'm bringing architecture into it. And the way he's analyzing, he has done monographic books, book-length monographs on each of these systems, and where he has a set of categories which work across all of these systems. So he's asking similar questions. For instance, what's the lead distinction? What is the binary code? He has questions like that. And so I was able to develop the Autopoiesis of architecture, the theory of architecture, in parallel to the monographic treatments under the overarching umbrella of functionally differentiated society and the theory of society of Luhmann, to develop a discourse analysis, and that's what he's actually doing. These are discourse analyses, but functionalizing and explicatory discourse analysis of these great function systems, and I did a similar job for architecture. So it's like architecture and design. He didn't have that. I was, you know, I was so frustrated with the fact, but it actually was great that I could deliver towards that. And basically, also what Luhmann has done here when he's doing this, obviously, he's reading up on, he's trying to understand all these domains and reading them comparatively and through a lens. Do they fit a certain grid? Because all of these are differentiated out from an overall societal environment, and as such, they might have similar problematics, similar issues. For instance, they all have to worry about self-demarcation, to clarify to all the participants what's belonging, which communications belong into the political discourse, and which ones need to be told that they don't belong here, they belong elsewhere. So the question of self-demarcation is a problem which reoccurs in all of these function systems. The question of, you know, trying to grapple with and understand the central raison d'etre of the function system is, you know, what is a societal function? So there's many parallels which we can find, similar problems which come along with this idea of self-referential closure and taking up a societal exigency of function, and do that exclusively and comprehensively. So basically the economy, these are integral unified systems. Now they're world and global spanning system, the sciences as well, and they are in charge of the totality of knowledge, right? Is science is in charge of the totality of, let's say, rigorous, systematic, and reproducible knowledge, of the knowledge of a quality which the rest of society can then rely on, build on, and use in business processes, use in technical processes, use also in political argument. You can refer to scientific studies to make your case, but it is not a political issue per se. Both opposition and so each of these systems uses the results of every other system to build on, and each system relies on, and society as a whole, that these aspects are taken care of, and we have to rely on them, and we can't interfere. So the political system, the ones that starts interfering with architecture, this is the end of architecture. Once politics starts to interfere with science, that's the end of science in that society. And that's Stalin tried to do that with biology, for instance. I mean, if they've done too much of this, they would have literally, you know, had a dysfunctional, collapsing society very quickly. But there was interference in the political branch into science. And particularly what is very vulnerable of influence and interference is the social sciences, the political, you know, the sciences and economic sciences. There's a lot of pressure, and therefore the ethos of the independence, the autonomy of science is very, very strong. And I think we should have the same ethos in architecture, the autonomy, that we're not put under pressure by the political system, by the economy, etc., in the same fashion. So, and of course, but all of these systems also rely on the economy of generating and making good decisions about profitability, what is profitable action and what is loss-making action, or profitable, unprofitable, so that we always have the resources flowing and we always clear who owns what and who has a claim on what, and that there's an overall growth trajectory, because we need all of these resources to feed, you know, the political system, the legal system. All of these protagonists and functionaries need to be paid off, and you know, investments in these domains need to be covered, etc., etc. So anyway, so I don't need to go any much further in this. And the mass media as well. The mass media, they're in charge of generating basically not scientific knowledge, but generating a shared worldview globally, so that the important changes, things, matters, problems, and issues are disseminated to everywhere, so we all know in which world we are living. For instance, at a certain point, we're living in the world where we have a major, war between Ukraine and Soviet Union with lots of ramifications, or that we're now living in a world in which, well, Joe Biden is now American president. We have, all of these news. Everybody knows the key news elements around the world, and we know that the recession, everything which the news media generate, brings everybody onto the same page. So it's a continuous updating of a shared worldview. Since in the world society, we definitely need that. But what is interesting that in the mass media is also included is fiction and movies, because we also we also live in the world, where we all of us have seen and understood and learned the lessons of certain movies or TV series, like, because learning how to live in the contemporary world maturely and understanding the complexity and not behave like a elephant in the porcelain shop. That's what we're learning. Not being blockheaded and atavistic in our social sensibilities. That's what you need. The mass media also deliver that. Anyway, so architecture and design is is one of those function systems which has its own particular tasks. So we're saying, for instance, the political system. Let me just go show it here, perhaps as well in that big panorama. What I have here is the different societal systems. So I have architecture, the art system, the sciences, education system, political system, legal system, the economy, the mass media, medical system. And then here I have a series of things we could compare them around, a series of categories which they all kind of address. How do they self-demarcate? How do they make sure that they distinguish themselves properly from neighboring domains, which they might be confused with? They have some basic operation which is typical for them. They have a lead distinction which organizes the discourse. They have binary codes which organizes the evaluative, let's say, decision making. They have programs which concretize these codes. They have a particular medium, and maybe say something about that. A particular medium through which which is specific to the function system, through which which helps the function system to function well. For instance, the economy has the medium of money, which is an enormously powerful medium through which you can not only transact across the world and across all the domains in the division of labor, but also you can have money as a fantastic way of counting and comparing quantitatively intensity of desires and scarcities, etc. But and it's a universal applicable. It's fantastic. You can use money for anything, for many things and everything nearly. For instance, the political system has a medium as well, what is called the medium of power, which means that relationship of instruction, whereas people are in charge, voted into position or appointed into position, and then you have this wonderful relation of subordination within that substructure. With respect to the other function systems, there is no hierarchy, there is no power. Political system has only very specific, restricted and restrained powers to frame some of the other function systems, but they're co-evolving without overarching center. So it's the other thing which Luhmann is saying. So we have the parallel system, the co-evolution of these systems. They're all autonomous and they observe the others and adapt themselves and evolve together with the others. But there's no overarching address, no center of society, no final, like it used to be at the head of the pyramid. So there's no address in which you could proselytize for and demand, that something should change. There is no overarching address. But within the political system, since you have the medium of power, which is very, very important and powerful, because you can use it for many things. Once you have power, you can instruct. I mean, it's not for everything. Constrained domain, you can kind of freely dispose of it and use it to have your subordinates do X, Y, or Z, redirect their efforts, etc. And that's a very, very versatile and flexible medium of action to generate, to get things done in the world, and also to have an improbable form of communication, this permanent asymmetry where somebody's always listening and somebody is let's say, instructing. Usually it would be quite unnatural, but with that medium and institutionalized, that everybody got used to it and accepts that, you have these organigrams and you can relate to that. And so, and basically, and money is also, and money can inflate, power can inflate, so they can also overdo it. And in architecture, you have the medium of the drawing and the digital model, which equally is a specific medium through which we deliver what we are doing. We're naming the spatio-morphological framing and semiological framing of all interactions. So all interactions in human society, they are framed by multiple ordering function systems. So whatever we do, we are doing it somewhere in an environment framed and articulated by a designer. So now I'm looking at Zoom, and there's a colleague of ours who has designed the interface, and where the buttons are and where the faces are and where I can present images and so on. And also we're sitting in a physical space which was designed by a colleague, separating us from other things. So that's every interaction is designed, it's framed by an architectural decision and an architectural product. That's what you deliver in society. But also every interaction is framed by the legal system, the law. So wherever we are, wherever we do, there is clear that certain things you shouldn't do, can't do. Whatever you've done, whatever you've talked or done to somebody is potentially a legal problem. You might have discriminated. There might be a lawsuit on that. You might have you have to defame somebody. There might be a libel case waiting for you, as well as everything you do, you say might become a political issue, which is different. So maybe you've discriminated somebody at work when you just thought you kind of communicating, but that becomes escalated into it's an outrage, and then a politician picks that up and says, these things have to stop. Let's say like the Me Too movement. So they become political issues, or Black Lives Matters, when there's a certain act becomes escalated into political domain. So everything we do is potentially political, is potentially legally, meaning it's framed by political constraints and ideologies, it's framed by legal conditions. It's also an economic act. Whatever I'm doing is an economic act. Some of the students are paying tuition fees to Tongji. I'm not actually sure if I'm getting paid for my professorship. But it's also an economic transaction at the same time. Nearly every act, every interaction is you go into a bar and maybe it's an implicit contract. Anyway, so that's the world we live in, where every interaction is framed by all of the most of the function systems. So, and basically what we can do here, I've tried this. I've took Luhmann's work and I've over systematized it, because his work migrates across decades and he's not always been 100% consistent. He's also, when he's writing one monograph, he's comparing it to the others, and then later on he's kind of reiterating and redescribing things. So I've then kind of systematized that into this tableau, where how architecture fits in, but also I had all these questions. What's the self-demarcation? What's the basic operation? What's the lead distinction? What's the binary code? What are the programs, which by the way are styles in architecture? What's the medium? Yes, there is such a specialized medium of communication in architecture, which is the drawing and the digital model. What's the task? Giving form to function. What's the societal function? That framing of social interaction, that spatial and semiological visual phenomenal framing of all interactions, so on and so forth. So it's very productive. And so I had the examples, all these, let's say, discourse analyses, and I've modeled my own discourse analysis on that. And I do have it here to go through, but I think I'm thinking it took too long to reach that. So I'm not going to go into that now, and we'll pick up tomorrow. So let me stop here. It's just the overall map, which I've reached, and getting into the details, into the weeds of that, I will leave for the next lecture. And let me stop sharing at this point.
Okay, and welcome Yan Chao. Would you like to turn on your video? Great. Probably we have Yan Chao, who is a professor, assistant professor teaching in Tongji, and also who graduated from Tongji, and his professor is Neil Leach. Actually, make research on architecture theory. So welcome.
Actually, Patrick, I just finished the translation of your new book, Tectonicalism.
Wow! Oh, really? Wow! Fantastic!
Yeah,
Thank you! Thank you! That's great. We can talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I have one of the lectures will be on style, where I will also refer to tectonicism.
Yes, maybe I would like to firstly ask a question, and then maybe the other follows. I think today Patrick talked a lot about Nicholas Luhmann's, who want to theorize actually the social networks, and also Patrick in the last diagram try to formalize this kind of matrix relationship in the social system, and at the same time Patrick argued the modes of the social differential networks actually give a very big influence to the architectural thinking. So that's the fundamental part of today, including the segmentation and including the functional differential relationship between this kind of social system. So I want to ask a question about the social networks, because that is very abstract, and also it depends on different situations you mentioned in your diagrams, the last diagram. So actually, is that possible to translate all these kind of social networks into a very abstract form or abstract structure, which could be represent skillessly to different urban or architecture system. So I just wonder if this kind of social system can review the initial logic of the social process, or the function. Maybe you mentioned the functional relationship inside the society, inside the social networks. So do you think in the urban system, this kind of abstractness can represent the highest hierarchy that also maybe leads to a formalism into a certain kind of stylistic ways to represent this kind of abstractness? So maybe the social networks can be present in different ways. Sometimes it's present, sometimes absence, as mentioned yesterday by Peter Eisenman. This kind of deconstructionism, actually, the form of the object of including the social networks is kind of an object which has some abstract process you can maybe to analyze or to represent it to some certain kind of form. Maybe the form is a kind of a differential relationship, as you mentioned, to represent this kind of social networks. So I wonder if all kinds of social networks or social logic could be represented in a certain way, in a differential way. This is the question one. And question two, how to scale up, scale down this kind of social networks? Because it seems like a continuous or the differential differential continuous in the connection of this kind of social networks. So sometimes we have an individual point, individual touch, individual experience in different scenarios, urban space. But sometimes it's quite collective. Maybe it's you stay in certain kind of open space, underground space, or maybe in a very high density space. So such kind of differential relationship is really complicated, which based on time and based on the density, or based on the ecological systematic relationships. So how would you like to address such kind of the social networks or system of communication? Is that reasonable to directly translate them to some certain kind of form or certain kind of relation or continue public space? Do you think is this kind of because you're talking about a lot about the Nicholas Luhmann's idea, so I just want to set up some relationship to your design, to Jaha office design. So what's the real relationship between this translation?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thanks a lot for the question. So yeah, in this, we're talking about the representation of the social network or the implementation of the social network on the ground. I mean, what we're talking up so far with respect to Luhmann is, first of all, more the clarification of a global societal network in which competencies are differentiated into professions or discourse domains, which are global. That does not necessarily, this aspect is only mapping out where the domains of competency and responsibility are for various aspects of structuring these, let's say, on the ground communication processes. And some of these communication processes are happening in physical proximity in urban centers or within university campuses, or, which I like a lot, the example of corporate campuses and corporate headquarters. And other of these, they exist more in the circulation of, for instance, journal papers, in the circulation of books across decades, or in other, you know, internet media platforms, etc. But even those communication types which are out there in these mediated, always need an architect, a designer, a colleague to frame it, because they all come with an embodied form, which has a wrapper which should already signal what's inside. And before you go to the final words, there is this kind of spatial structure, for instance, of the book. And there's been experiments in deconstructivism. I mean, it hasn't gotten very far, where there was a strong idea of innovating even that in terms of the typography, two parallel running text, highlights, interlacing of texts, etc., etc. It's an interesting question, but what I find fascinating when it comes to those non-spatialized networks, that through the metaverse and through the immersive spatialized Web 3, they will become more in our domain. But that's one thing. But going to those aspects of the communication processes which are, you know, co-located in space, that's where we're getting into, we're getting into a spatialization of that network, where those who are communicating are co-located, and you bring them together in shared spaces. You also assume that degree of mobility, and then it's all about how you lay that out, how you have keep people updated what's going on elsewhere. And this becomes a very interesting and complex problem the larger the organization is. The risk of a large organization, let's say Google campus, where you have thousands of participants, you still want them to come together. You still think that they're important to each other. That this falls apart and doesn't work anymore is very large. So we need to really be inventive and really be quite innovative to maintain that sense of interaction and get sufficient knowledge exchange, inter-awareness, etc. So that's where we're trying to develop these spaces and we're trying to study the network, we actually need to do more. We can't just get somebody writing a schedule of accommodation and saying, I need these 10 meeting rooms. It's the whole question is if I have 55, 100 meeting rooms of various sizes, I need to also develop those, first of all, that menu, but how do I cluster them? How do I distribute them at the end exits, at the center? What do I have? How do they know of each other? And I can also use, of course, now other augmented reality overlays, information overlays to bring this together. So that's where we have the network becoming manifest, concretely in projects we're doing. That's the fascination. And of course, we need, in terms of the, what's important is here that we're doing this with a set of principles which would be formulated in the heuristics of the style and method, which include a methodology we bring to bear on the problem like that. So and which solution space we're searching and finding these network configurations. Certainly not in a minimalist or modernist world, you don't find these solutions. So we need to open up. So that would be my answer here. But the thing is that before we get there, we need to, in a sense, carve out our core competency, which also means demarcating and seeing what's our task versus what's, for instance, various engineering disciplines and specialisms which help us deal with a lot of the technical and physical constraints which coming on. And for instance, when we look at the differentiation of function systems, when I said the sciences, I should have said science and engineering. They're closely connected, or they could, in a sense, if that's an incomplete list of function systems, there's the function systems of engineering. Somebody could write the Autopoiesis of engineering as a profession, as a discipline, as a discourse. And of course you say, well, there's many different engineering disciplines. Yes, like there are many different, let's say, interior design, fashion design, and so on. But there's something which all the engineers share in terms of an ethos, in terms of a drive for economy, for material efficiency, for robustness and so on. So that is an interesting one, and we need to understand that we were one undifferentiated complex and discourse. In the history of architecture, there was always, the key categories were utility, utilitas, firmitas, venustas. In the English translation, instead of utility, firmness, and delight. And that idea of firmness, that idea of technical functionality has been separated out. That's no longer, that's a separate discourse now, which we need to integrate. Anyway, for instance, that's one of the things which I'm doing at this stage of the lecture is we have to separate out, we have to differentiate the competency. We look at the boundary conditions, demarcating against, for instance, things we might have been confused with because we were part of, which is, for instance, the engineering disciplines. But also on the other side, we often at times confused with the art systems and the art world. But this has I think that has very much separated. And I have sometimes given a lecture about this, let's say, the demarcation problem, where we also then see that there are different competencies which we need to differentiate out. And we also, the engineers cannot dictate solutions, right? They only, we pose the problems, they deliver, but they always have many options, and they deliver constraints within which we can then make decisions for ourselves. And the art system brings maybe inspirations which we select or don't select. A fantastically successful art movement doesn't mean that now architects have to imitate and use those forms. Not at all. We are autonomous, and some of us might be inspired and bring that in. And of course, this differentiation, for instance, between architecture and engineering was a process which started in the late 19th century, where you have architectural schools of architecture. Still, there are two versions of it. There are those who attach themselves to the art school and those who are the technical universities. So you have in Vienna, you have the TU, the Technical University, and you have the Angewandte, the Applied Arts. And you have the Art Academy. So you have actually 3 versions. And but similarly, so in the differentiation was a long process. So that's the kind of topic which I'm talking about here. And once we understand what we're in charge of, we then look at what the contemporary conditions are, for instance, of the spatio-phenomenological framing of interactions, and that they're different from the modernist eras from 1950. But what has already reached in 1950 was that separating out of the engineering from the architect, as well as from the artist. For instance, in the Bauhaus, you can see it viscerally. The Bauhaus originally had a very romantic idea of bringing in, of saying a unification of all the arts in the great building. And Gropius invited, Vasily Kandinsky and Joseph Itten and Oskar Schlemmer and and Paul Klee was there, and then he invited the architects, as like Mies van der Rohe and many others. And he also did still think of engineering being part of it somehow. But what happened in the mid-20s when Hannes Meyer took over, but also it was a general tendency that school became a 100% architecture and design school, and all the artists left, and we had a total separation. And you do have that great inspiration of modern architecture through modern art. You have this style, you have the Mondrian and Duisburg thing, and you have the Malevich, Lesitsky thing. But by the end of the 20s, that's separated out, and you have that full-on demarcation. And for instance, the next art movements have no impact into architecture. Surrealism, the great movement of the 1930s, what does it have to do, modernism or early brutalism in architecture? So anyway, just sort of out, that's the panorama. That's what we look out for when we're reading Luhmann. We look at these differentiations of discursive competencies and profession, which is a process where things were, keep differentiating out. And I was then, there could be further differentiations. And once we know what we're in charge of, then we look at, for instance, we're looking at social functionality in terms of framing of and ordering of complex productive communication processes. For me, the paradigm, let's say, the most complex and sophisticated and rewarding and interesting kinds of projects are, for me, remaining oftentimes these corporate campuses, but a university campus is equally interesting, but also mixed-use complexes where there's a lot of synergies between the parts, a lot of openness and connections and affiliations where things work together. There's a reason why things come together. These are the most interesting projects for me. That's what you call the, spatializing the social network. That's what we're doing, and I think we have tools for that. And these tools are charting the network somehow. It's social science, big data, churning to understand what the potentials are, what the inter-awarenesses are, what the connections are, what the communications patterns maybe are online, and can you replicate it to enhance offline and in space. So we're doing this, and Emmanuel Koh has been working on the social network analysis, diagramming, and there's a whole mathematics of network analysis, which I think should come into, and that's also in my book in volume 2, where I'm rehearsing network theory, social network theory, which is also the mathematics. In mathematics, it's often called graph theory, is coming in as a strong influence and competency into architecture. I mean, actually, it has arrived through space syntax. Unfortunately, that has not been absorbed much, and a lot of architects, and I think it's what the frustration with our discipline, are oblivious to that and think they can still just intuitively do stuff and ignore space syntax. But what I'm pointing out as well, that for instance, the space syntax paradigm is interesting, but it only picked up like a very, very tiny set of measures. In graph theory, you have several hundred measures, and theoretical concepts you could look at, and space syntax works with 5 out of 500, or let's say 5 out of 50 potentially relevant. And then the next thing for me is obviously these agent-based simulations, which are informed by the network graph, because what you find now, a lot of an agent-based simulations, the first round, I mean, I'm talking social science simulations also in economics and sociology. The first round was, you had you had heterogeneous agents. They were just different types with different strategies, but they had no network relations mapped onto them. They were just, you know, a diversity of population which randomly can interact. And the later stages and current stages of network analysis, they're overlaying that with network graphs, so that the probability of connecting up in an interaction with another agent in the field is dependent on prior communication. So you stitch up a network which evolves together with the let's say in the agent model. So that's something we also want to integrate when we do agent-based models. So that's the way we work. And you're quite right that Luhmann's theory is pointing towards that. He basically his one of his major students is who I've been communicating with is a guy called Dirk Becker, who is writing about, you know, he's trying to find a new category, new term for upgrading, let's say, Luhmann's work, which is by now also, you know, over 20 years old. He's trying to talk about the network rather than the functionally differentiated society, the network society.
Who else would like to put a question?
Yeah, Patrick, I think I would like to discuss with you about your new book, but I think tomorrow's topic might be more kind of suitable to the book you were just writing. So today I think the topic is still kind of society and social relations. So I think, well, my first question is, well, if you look at Michel Foucault when he's studying the panoptical, and he concluded that I don't remember exactly, but what he was trying to say is the only thing decides the power relation is the power relation itself. So the spatial relation can only kind of amplifying the existing power relations. So in that sense, I don't know if you agree on this kind of conclusion. So applying to what we have been kind of listening, what you have been talking about the relationship between architecture and the social relations. So maybe we can also conclude what architecture can do is only kind of accelerating or amplifying or kind of reflecting the existing social relations. So in that sense, my first question is, can architecture be inventive in that sense, or architecture can only follow the existing social progress, or architecture can really kind of invent some kind of new social relations? I think that's my first question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's an important question I've been pondering a lot, and yeah, I think probably I don't think we can single-handedly invent new social relations, particularly not in a utopian, disconnected fashion. So yeah, largely, I think what the task is, and that goes on for any of the function systems and the innovation, because they're basically each function system and each protagonist within it, each innovator is located in one of the function systems. So there's no overarching, you know, floating above it all protagonist, let's say. I mean, maybe if there was one, it's maybe the philosophers, But even the philosophers are now humbling themselves as being maybe a midwife or a contributor to some domain which they're engaging with, for instance, the science as a philosophy of science or political philosopher. They don't want to stand back and invent something. They do innovation and contributions before understanding closely what's been happening. And so because each of the subsystems, so architecture has to adapt to the overall, that's the paradox. There's an overall co-evolution where nobody's in charge, and every sub-element in the co-evolution is watching and trying to adapt itself to the overall drift, to the overall progress. But there is no master plan, because there's no address, no position, no Archimedean position where, and politics isn't that either. As I said, politics cannot determine where sciences go. They can't. I mean, we had to give up on politics trying to determine totality of the economic system. That leads to a collapse, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the revolution, the fantastic, let's say, Deng Xiaoping revolution made that clear also in a positive sense, and the collapse of the Soviet Union made it clear in the negative sense. So that means, yes, you're quite right. We can accelerate, we can facilitate, we can read tendencies, and particularly nascent tendencies that we are supporting them, that we're seeing they have potential. And if we now give room and space and find something congenial, that's where the innovation comes in. Something congenial which gives them more space, more acceleration, gives them better framework, then we can help. We become the midwives. But it's strange, all of us are midwives of something which is in the end collectively all of us again. But you can't stand outside and say, stop everybody, let's all discuss one big master plan. That's the complexity barrier, where Luhmann says in the finally, he says, realize, well, no, the overall progress of society is a emergent evolutionary process. And there is no master. I mean, in this way, he understands with when Lyotard, the end of the grand narratives. These master theories and utopias have no credibility because there are too many moving parts. And even each of the fields, each of the each of the subsidiary domains, some of them become so rich and complex and ramifying that there's no single figure who understands the totality of it, even of a single scientific discipline, let alone the sciences. So that these are critical problems, although there's always, I think I'm always supporting attempts to deliver unified descriptions, to collect what's going on, to try to orient everybody instead of letting everybody beaver in their local adaptations and connections and networks, and to see more where the overall thing is drifting. It's very interesting, but you know it when you see it. Basically, I think there's still room for somebody, and I see maybe that's more of the art system, where you have that freewheeling experimentation, where you just intuitively throw out recklessly and irresponsibly and with a large, let's say, likelihood of failure, large likelihood of, like these are the pure mutations on the system, that you could be something discovered, which people are running with, which is a great invention. I think there are moments like this in architecture, perhaps. For instance, the atrium, the idea of John Portman to hollow buildings. Wow. There's something comes in and catches on, and what else could we think of? I think there was an attempt, and you have it oftentimes in revolutionary periods, when you have the late 60s, early 70s. There was this thing where, it also was fitting in with tendencies. Let's say these soft furniture scapes, where you throw away the typologies of a dining table and the sofa with coffee table and the chair and the desk, and you have scapes, abstract scapes. You can roam around and stand and sit and configure in various ways and had no clear center. I mean, we love these things. I mean, that's part of these playscapes, something which we rediscovered in early parametricism. So you could try that. You can. I mean, you have to define the client. You have to find an institution, and oftentimes this might be, you know, quite at the edge, charismatic people who are a bit, you know, take huge risks. So in this sense, that through experimentation you could. I don't know if, you know, and some people have the sensibility for it, but the likelihood of failure is obviously very large, or that it just becomes a curiosity, that it doesn't catch on. But oftentimes you find that these things have something to give. And so I think that you know, oftentimes what architecture also has done is it writes these retroactive manifestos. So I was saying, you know, everything is now controlled by the discipline, by the field. That's true in terms of professional designers, but there's still stuff which crops up, still those situations where ignored by architects, like Las Vegas, for instance. Yes, they hired some, you know, marginal figures. They ignored the discipline. They generate this kitsch stuff, and it was not. But there's something which you know. Then there's learning from Las Vegas, for instance, or you know, the Delirious New York, where, you know, let's say the overall shape of Manhattan was nobody planned it, nobody designed it. There were also, I mean, and then you have Delirious New York of that, or you have bigness. These are retroactive manifestos of these ugly, big, fat buildings, malls, which, yes, there were architects, but there were nobody published these malls. Nobody wanted to know them. They were totally outside. Sometimes you have this as an inspiration, but it becomes through a manifesto. So this was originally outside the discourse of architecture, but there is stuff cropping up there. And you can go there and render it a number of times and others, and write the manifesto, the retroactive manifesto, bring it in and say, hey, look at this. There's something we shouldn't ignore. There's something we can run with, something innovative, something, you know. But what is good about this, there is a vitality to this already, and it's not a pure invention. It's something which I think, and that I believe, you have to have the antennas and feelers out about what's vital, what's happening in society. I mean, there was this idea of some kind of, there's the strange intensity of Tokyo. I don't know if you remember that, in the 80s, there was this kind of celebration of the chaos of Tokyo, yeah, where one says, okay, how could, you know, that, you know, influences ideas of collage city, influencing some kind of aesthetic. So that's what we often have seen, that some of these radical innovations were actually also following society. So there's a lot to be said about spontaneous outcroppings. One should have one's antennas out there to see where, you know, whether some of these solutions are found by the outcasts, the mavericks, those who ignore the tenets and lessons of a highly sophisticated profession, and find something raw. And that is between artists and these kind of, let's say, and I think there is a role for this. So when I'm saying, you know, the moment the discipline is totally fragmented, when I'm talking about the hegemonic epochal style of parametricism, and we need everybody and many to participate, I don't mean 100%. I mean something like 60, 70, 80%. I don't want 100%. You need some of these. You always need the, let's say, those who are experimenting with raw intuition and architectural mutations, but I don't know where you get them from, you know, that, because I don't think we can compute what will be successful. So we do need to have a lot of trial and error in this. That's where these things come from. But ultimately, you're right. I mean, we have to. It's an adaptive, having the congenial ways of letting the built environment follow where society wants to go. And ultimately, for me, I'm a little bit different from Luhmann. Luhmann has these; they're all equally valid and parallel. I do find that the economy has a certain gravitas and importance. If you interfere there too much through politics or through false land use policy, you compromise the overall prosperity engine, you get more into trouble. So that's something where I would say the economy has slightly the head above the rest, and other assistants are kind of facilitating, let's say the prosperity engine. But what that means, that what I'm just said, is something which it's not easy to tease out.
Yeah, I think you're quite.
It doesn't mean that economists are in charge. Anyway, you go ahead.
But yeah, I think you are quite right. But it's still kind of about time specific. But if, for example, if we look back to the 20th century, maybe the political aspect may kind of lead more compared to the others. But I think generally, well, I totally agree. And also, I think some of the parts you have brought up, for example, the kind of anti-architectural tendency in the 1960s. I think that's also very interesting, and also lead to what I was trying to ask as the second question. Well, since when we build a building, it's gonna stand there for kind of 100 years, right? So in a certain sense, architecture as a kind of static material existence, it cannot actually co-evolve with the social progress. It somehow, because the social can kind of change itself, the society can change itself every day, day by day, but the architecture stand there kind of for at least kind of a few decades. So what do you see kind of this kind of tendency in time?
Yeah, I disagree to some extent. I mean, I think also the major, let's say, socioeconomic or structural transformations of society, which also affect, life outlooks, family structures, mobility, globalization, all of these, they are also they're also more measured in decades than in years. So that's why I think it's problematic for anyway, that we should look at those structural transformations which are measured in decades rather than more fast shifting current sensibilities and movements and urgencies. That's my criticism actually of the Biennales.
Sure.
The way they've been taken over by current affairs, refugee crisis, suddenly everybody has to talk about refugee crisis or Black Lives Matters or certain, or there is something longer term like development problems in certain third world countries and so on. That's not the time scale of architecture, but the things like I've been talking about, for instance, the great epochal styles, the way that we're talking about the shift from early capitalism and city states into national economies under mercantilism. Each of these transitions takes quite a few decades, and then once the system settles in, it runs for a number of the older systems, obviously longer, hundreds of years, and then it's more measured in decades in the 20th and 21st century. But the industrialization obviously is a big thing, which took maybe a few decades, and then it also takes time to spread around the world. And then, so when we're talking about mechanical mass reproduction and this highly large concentrated form of capitalism and social democracy, controlled capitalism, that was emerged. I mean, there's certain moments when it's fast, where the revolution happens, but it was prepared. And it runs over decades. So this whole era was maybe, I would say, about, if you take the long view, it was up to 100 years. When you have the big corporate conglomerates and first quasi-socialism in Germany under Bismarck in the 1880s. And in 1890, it finally, or maybe only in 1990, it finally comes really to an end. Yeah. So these are, and then you have this transformation into post-Fordism. Of course, it announces itself. It starts maybe in the, in the late 60s, 70s. So there's overlap conditions, but it really takes off only in the 1980s. And since then, I think that's the trajectory. I don't believe, for instance, that we have to shift again. I mean, that we have to have a new paradigm shift, and we have a new epoch to reckon with, which is different from what I call post-Fordist network society. I think the trajectory of China is a clear part of that, Thatcherism, Reaganism, and then it went through most of Europe, even Sweden. It was privatizing and became part of a neoliberal restructuring. That's a global process. It got into, unfortunately, it went into some kind of stalemate. Once you had the deepest crises have been overcome, the further transformations were slowing down. And there was more of a kind of settling into more of a kind of slow growth paralysis, unfortunately. But nothing really new. There was a bit of a rollback, an attempt to roll back, but I don't think it's stable. You have an oscillating standoff between, let's say, more neoliberal efforts of privatization, low taxes, more entrepreneurial freedom, and let's say a social democratic backlash. Unfortunately, I think, but there's nothing radically different. I think the project is still, for me, globalization, liberalization, more degrees of economic freedom, entrepreneurship, markets and market processes, and the new blockchain phenomenon is one fantastic example, I think, where you have an enormous amount of innovation which we need, which is usually not much space for. And we obviously, there are certain risks with all of that. So I don't think that I think in terms of decades. So for instance, that paradigm of the current, let's say, what I call post-Fordist restructuring, which became, the post-Fordist neoliberal development paradigm, is still valid, undiminished, because the technological underpinnings of computational empowered, flexible specialization, as we talked about, this, becomes all the more expressed, more extreme, with robotic fabrication, 3D printing, small series, adaptive, everything reprogrammed, everything unique, software as service, uploading of new versions and updates, and I mean, R&D dominance. Everybody could become an innovator, because the ability to absorb innovations now is huge. And each innovation means that you have to communicate, you have to be hopefully permissionless. Innovation can, rather than being locked up in let's say red tape processes, but then you have, with each you would have to communicate your market, R&D, marketing, financing, all of that flourish. So we in that world still, and continues. I don't see a major shift. And even, the interesting shift comes if we more homework for urbanism is more homeworking versus metaverse and so on. That's a new one. But if you think about it, when we started talking about, and I said this started in the 80s, which was first expressed to postmodernism, then the same problems were addressed through deconstructivism, the same problems and issues were addressed and better addressed through parametrism. That developed a number of years. So let's say we're talking about a full-on 40 years into this paradigm, and I think there's no really a shift. So that's enough time for not rebuilding, historic centers, but really shifting the physiognomy and build environment, even in the advanced countries. In China is a total transformation. And of course, and you could redo it if there was a major shift. You would have to redo it. It takes time. But there's no doubt that the London of the 1960s and 70s and England and the built environment of the current England has radically transformed. And you also have this whole shift from back into the cities, the urban concentration process. I mean, there is maybe now something different. I don't think it's a different socioeconomic paradigm, but maybe the built environment through another form of technology, the metaverse, we react differently to that. So the change of direction comes in two parts. That question makes that clear. The change of direction has two parts. It has where society is driving in terms of the problem posed and the way the economy evolves. And the other question is the tools and technologies which we can facilitate that driving. So that imposes a change. So we have always new problems and new issues and agendas and tasks to solve, but we also get new tools, new technologies, in new computational design techniques and technologies. And we, in the modernism, we also had new steel, glass, concrete, as well as a new patterns, the new demands. We had new solution spaces. So that's always possible. So maybe for the economy and also for the architecture design discipline, the metaverse is a new, let's say, technological element. Technology is always the real agency in history, I think. But let's say where post-Fordist network society, with respect to the autopoiesis of architecture, gets a different, let's say, set of recipes and potentials, which doesn't mean that the direction of society changes in terms of socioeconomic processes, but in terms of our discipline, we have a new option of addressing that. But it's in decades. We have to think in decades. We can't think in current affairs in years. And just because there was a financial crash in 2008, that didn't change anything in terms of the historic trajectory, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah, when looking at the kind of social economic structure, it's still kind of ongoing and still kind of the same, kind of having the same features or same characteristics we have been looking at for the past decades. That's very true.
Yep.
And I also quite agree. I think currently architecture or arts kind of lost of its kind of profoundness when we're looking at society. We kind of focusing more on the kind of urgent issues, the emerging problems, but kind of lose our visions to really think through the deeper, the profound structure, how the society is progressing. I quite agree on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, can I follow on the discussion? You know, you are all discussing into a very big topic. Oh my goodness! But it's really good and very inspiring, because you are really talking about the level of architecture and, you know, giving, you know, us, you know, what do you mean, you know, where do you place architecture in this, you know, the current era, which is really good. I mean, we really need this kind of information. So, and I think we have a lot of questions coming on from the audience and everything. But for me, because right now we are on this doctoral consortium, we want to, you know, communicate with students. So, you know, after all this lecture, so what do you want to give to the students? What do you want them to take away from your lecture? You know, giving up all this, giving them all these informations, and, you know, your take, and, you know, putting in this new architecture in this table, which is really impactful. So just a small questions before moving on.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, particularly looking at the doctoral students, that they, the way they posit their research thesis, you know, fits squarely into the key agendas and task domain of architecture, progressing this, seeing where one can make a contribution. It's very important. And also fitting that into, you know, into the overall trajectory of technological progress and how it interfaces with the architectural opportunities, etc. So that framing is very important. And with respect to, I mean, I also have one student working under my direct guidance that fits quite well into this as well. You know, I haven't come to that, and these lecture series is more about the basic framing coming out of volume 1 and volume 2. And since I've been talking a lot about these kind of, I mean, mentioned a number of times the agent-based simulations, and we have talked about the semi-logical project and how you can operationalize this with agent-based simulations and show that a semi-logically encoded built environment is more empowering. for quickly discriminate and understand, facilitate interactions and communication exchange. And we're now working with this on the phenomenological problematic, which in the agent-based model we just assume to be unproblematic, which is a, let's say, a abstracting, highly simplifying assumptions, and to working on looking at the cognitive grasp in very complex, and you see, environments. I mean, that's the kind of complex spaces we generate, like you see in my background, or what we're now working in, for instance, in China, on a number of amazing new mixed-use complexes, and for instance, Tower C in Shenzhen. When we look at these kind of environments, we say, wow, these are really challenging. The story here is we have very many different institutions who are relevant, who want to close to each other, want to be in view with each other, want to participate in each other's footfall. How do you make this kind of complexity legible, navigable? How do you ensure that you could fully utilize it rather than missing out and not finding, not seeing, not being aware of many of the things which want to come together and synergize? So that's what's the thesis here. And what's interesting about the thesis is that the same issues, when you bring in many offerings into a synergy game of an urban center or an urban complex, we have the same thing in the metaverse. So here we have, for instance, the PhD thesis working on these issues of phenomenological tractability, recognition, navigation, and working with agents and AI systems and experimentation and simulations to get a hold of that problem. So that's really something which fits very much into the overall arc of research I've plotted out, particularly in volume 2 and beyond. And it also is addressing issues of the metaverse. I think when it comes to the metaverse condition, we actually have the same problems of that complex interlacing and everybody wanting to be in close and connected with everybody else, which is obviously an impossible infinite project. In the metaverse, you have even more pressure on that, and you have more dynamism. So that's the way we place the thesis. It is placed within the framing, obviously, of the Autopoiesis of architecture, and the way I'm framing the issue of what we are in charge of in terms of ordering and facilitating social processes in the era of complexity and intensifying interconnectivity, where you need continuously to exchange and be aware of what everybody else is doing. Whatever anybody is now doing is so dependent on so many moving parts, which they need to stay in touch with. Because if you work on this particular app, it's very important what the competitors are doing, what is the synergy stack in which this fits in, and if this is kind of evolving away from you, you've wasted your, so you need to be plugged in. And how do we do that? And so these and we need to develop that space, both urbanistically, physically, and incubator spaces, as well as metaverse wise. So basically working on something which I think is central to the problematics and to the contribution which architecture is called upon to develop to human progress, in which I defined, I started yesterday with, material freedom, prosperity, productivity gains as the primary thing, where I just said the economy is, let's say, the output of material freedom is the final end game, and how architecture fits in there. So, by the way, so that's, and I think that that's the message, hopefully, that this panorama helps students to see where the frontier is, where the pain points and problems, unresolved problems are, where they see the innovation, also where to be at the center of things somehow, or open up a new center which fits. We said before, the tragedy is really if you're in a dying research branch, or you beavering away into irrelevancy, or nobody will look at it. It doesn't fit in. It doesn't. So it has no resonance. It won't be successful. I mean, you know, and oftentimes that is sometimes a strategy. Well, I want to do something which I'm unique and I have no competitor. So, you know, but oftentimes, you know, it's better to be at the center of things. That's my message.
Thank you. I think I have a few more questions, which I think will very relate to your topic, but I think I will let, there's this student who want to, you know, give some questions. Daniela, you want to give the questions yourself, or do you want me to read your questions?
I'll go ahead and read them. Hi, Patrick. Hi, everyone. So 2 related questions. The first one is the relationship between this idea of the coevolution and coadaptation of function systems without a master plan and the relation of that to urban master planning. And then the second question, which is a little bit related, is I'm asking you to explain your position that architecture is not art in relation to the emerging market of metaverses. And how do you predict this new mode of communication will transform architecture, discourse, and practice? And do you think the metaverse will eventually differentiate itself as a new autopoietic function system? And this is kind of radical within the sphere of how you kind of formed the autopoiesis of architecture, or will the metaverse continue to remain a reflection of societal function systems as they exist? So you can take that in any direction.
Interesting. I mean, so obviously, if you take a category like the metaverse, or you would, you know, it would be the equivalent would be, let's say, the city. There is many contributors and many function systems which feed into the overall phenomenon. It's nearly like, you know, society. So, but there is obviously what is interesting for us as architects or designers, that is obviously designing task and domain for us to frame the interactions, but we're not in charge of the content. So it is also it's an opportunity for economics to consider Web3 and economic or business. The economy is also in the metaverse. So the economy has that expansion going online and going metaverse with new opportunities. Architects and designers will be in there. It's like the city. The city is also a playing field for designers. Engineers contributing to the city. Engineers are also contributing to the metaverse. So it's I don't think it opens up a new function system, right? It opens up a new domain where various function systems come together again to further develop, let's say, human communication and cooperation. That would be that. So, and the other questions were interesting in terms of the co-evolution without master plan, without central Archimedean point and address. There's no address you can go and complain to, or proselytize, or protest to, or demand, you know, demand reform. You only have reforms in the various subsidiary systems. So yes, and how does it relate to master planning? Yeah, the difficulty of master planning anything is kind of becoming urgent and becoming more and more clear, but it doesn't mean that there's no role for planning and plotting out strategies, which need to be, you know, have a lot of tolerance for contingency, have inherent adaptability. That's why it's going to be parametric master planning in the. I mean, there's no equivalent of that in the global arena of where world civilization is going. I think that's an evolutionary process, and the idea of, let's say, which Hegel and Marx still had, that there could be a self-conscious global democratic control of the overall human process, progress, and project, where it doesn't confront all of us as a kind of self-propelling evolutionary process we have to live with and serve. That I think is, I personally don't, I think we have to give up on that, and we have to, in a sense, kind of thrive and live with and enjoy and accept that we have to, that we are have to select our domain of innovation in that co-evolution process, and that we have to make make contributions which we never come to a decision point where we all have a global election that we're switching that switch here. I think that's a utopia we have to all forget about. And as you know, I'm also, being an architectural theorist with a lot of, and that's where I launched my career and profession. And but you know, I'm somebody who is a keen observer, reader, and that's slowly becoming contributor to, let's say, socioeconomic, political, let's say, political economy discourses. And there I'm trying to build up a contribution on that level, which then I would might feed back into the architecture, as has been happening. So when I wrote the Autopoiesis of Architecture, I wasn't yet it just had started to be more strongly free market oriented and libertarian orientation. I have since developed a series of writings in this direction, which made, it's in a sense reinforcing the tendencies you find in Luhmann. His skepticism for any central planning, his skepticism for hierarchical, democratic, otherwise control systems, was only intensified through my recent understandings and political let's say, investments. They haven't yet. The Autopoiesis of Architecture stands robust in the face of that. Let's put it this way. And there's congenialities, and I have it in Permanentism 2.0. I have the article of hegemonic permanentism facilitating market-based urban order. Such writings, they have been very much grappling, which I discussed at the end of last lecture, with that how we can have a kind of light-footed, flexible, reactive, multi-author, still planning process. And what is interesting about plans, they're often, you need them. You need to always project ahead, otherwise you can't act. And that's in all domains of life. But they have a very different status. And they should also ideally be about facilitating and framing, for instance, individual and corporate and entrepreneurial actors to then fill out and be articulated, which they can't do by themselves, so that what they're about, it's a little bit with the previous question. So this whole idea of organizing and articulating what? Something which wants to be organized and articulated. There's this idea of congeniality, that there's a fit, a facilitative fit. In the end, it has to come through with the purposes of coming together in places and spaces, so that there's a flourishing, which I think still the best way to measure that is overall prosperity and productivity and competitiveness in an overall economic process. But that's not the only criterion, obviously, which brings together. There's other indicators. We can talk at the question of indicators of overall societal success. What would they be? My orientation is more towards productivity gain, because that's the future orientation. You can have a lot of satisfaction and happiness temporarily, but if you don't have the 3, 4, 5% growth, you really will 30, 40 years later it will catch you out. So that's why I think what is most exciting and important is that we have the growth trajectory, and if we're master planning, we need to do it in ways that we're not ossifying, that we are facilitating, engendering, and that we are flight-footed quickly. Also, with for instance, what's great about the metaverse, with the way it intersects in the cyber and urban incubator, cyber urbanism, that you could have you test the plan and bring in market participants digitally and virtually before you roll out and go into physically, etc., etc. But the main point I want to make at the end of here, right? What in the end, the end game is that while we are as satisfied and happy and content, we also always push forward, allowing the future to be better and better. That means we should always watch out over the overall per capita growth trajectory, let's say. But we are, and I don't think that isn't, by the way, in contradiction with ecological projects. Anyway, that's where I would leave it for now. But the overall societal master plan, no, but what I believe in, with the degrees of freedom we get, and if we have competitive, Darwinian competitive weeding and processes where think both, project forward and find imitators, the successful will win, we will have progress. That's on an abstract level, that's wonderful. We can nearly guarantee that if we have that dynamism and growth dynamics, and if we get this right, but we don't know where we end up. We don't know what it looks like, that kind of life and world where productivity has quadrupled. And maybe we have to live with that. Maybe we can tolerate that this is an unpredictable, unknowable, the concreteness of this. But I love also the discovery. I want to be around and discover that. And one thing is very comforting, that it is quadruple prosperity. So it's probably tolerable, probably more fun and pleasure and empowerment and material freedom than now. But I don't need to prejudice what this might look like. Maybe it is a total, I don't know, a totally metaverse, 95% digital life. I'm up for it if it's quadruple prosperity.
Okay, yeah, you just touched on this metaverse topic. This is yeah, I would really love to go into more details about it, but I think I would really want to also touch on this topic, not just the metaverse, but you were also talking about thinking beyond architecture, because right now with metaverse and with all this AI and everything, you actually have we are really moving beyond just architecture. We are doing transdisciplinary. We are really looking at all the other discipline and integrating them into the architecture. Because you're also talking about all the sociologies and everything, how do you actually see, you're also talking about all this law, economics, socials, educations, and all these things where it is also related to architecture, even though architecture have this sole propriety, effect, have its own sole function. So I'm just wondering, how do you, in architecture theory, right now, all these transdisciplinary, we are just using them as some kind of method. But how do you see them as to fit into this architecture theory? When you want to talk about connecting with other discipline, with technology, with all these different kind of informations and everything. So that's what I was saying, this lecture you give is very important, because everybody start to get lost within all this transdisciplinary, this kind of architecture theory. Everybody is just looking at technology, looking at all this individual component. But where do they place in this architecture theory right now?
Yeah, there's quite a diversity of, let's say, basically allowing the field to be informed, inspired by other fields, right? That's what we're talking about. So where can we gain new competencies which allow us to make a more impact and facilitate human progress better with our spatial framings? And I mentioned it earlier, there's a number of domains where we can come in. One of the domains, I mentioned it just now, for instance, in terms of the organizational project, if we empower us more through tools and techniques of network analysis and graph theory, I mean, space syntax plus, all of these agent-based simulations I've been talking about, but also the sciences in terms of, for instance, semi-logical project. You can sit there, and I've done that with students over a number of years, and some of our projects we've developed systems of signification, distinctions, morphologies, and we've learned a lot. Where do I get these insights from? It's not so much out of the purely architectural semiology discourse, which was relatively primitive and simple and disappeared. It was emerging in the 60s and 70s. It's basically, for instance, linguistic science, the world of also the worlds like the representation of information in terms of science diagramming, as well as diagrammatic reasoning, etc. So there's other sciences and discourses, but particular in terms of semiological project, there is linguistics as a domain where we can draw categories, ideas, and insights, which I've worked through in, for instance, volume 2 and writing since. So these are the different sciences. And the other thing is, when it comes to the phenological projects, you know, cognitive science, the psychology of perception, for instance, and also when we want to go into multimodal perception, where it's not only visual, but it's vestibular, it's maybe auditories. We need more registers, for instance, there, and how do we understand our cognitive processes and learning capacities? Sorry for. So there's so many domains, and of course the sheer technology of material science, which moves through the engineering disciplines, but we can be the protagonists because we see applications, bring them in as proto-engineers, and then let the engineers help us deliberate them.
Happens to every one of us.
This model is real.
I think it's about time maybe we can continue.
Daniela, where are you? In Chicago?
I'm located in the Chicago area, yes.
Okay,
And
great.
yeah,
So,
and also
architect or?
Yeah, so there are many fronts on which we're interfacing. If we know what our task is, if we know what our agenda is and our responsibility is, our competency, which nobody else can, let's say, invade, and nobody else but us as discipline are in charge, and everybody's relying on us to deliver, then we can also see all the tools, new insights, new techniques, etc., which flow into us. And you know, Daniela was asking about art, and there's a lot of inspiration which can flow in from art, because art is really unencumbered with the direct pressures of functioning. They just get resources to play, and oftentimes they've been playing with new technologies, and it was very productive. I mean, there used to be internet art when the internet didn't know yet what, was experimentation with that, and that's no longer so much prevalent. But for instance, what I find very interesting in art is, over the years, all these interactive installations where you have sensors and actuators, and you try it on audiences, how things shift and move and respond to, pressure pads or cameras. So for me, these are kind of things where you can start to see that and maybe think, wow, this is an inspiration for what I call, for instance, responsive, adaptive, or spontaneous environments where you have where you have real-time interaction and responsiveness and facilitation. I mean, they will then be instrumentalized. In art, they're not. In art, they're just, you can go only so far. You play, you make an inspiration, you get some kind of technologies ready, but they're not fulfilling any purpose. But for instance, you can get inspired there, and you can also then use that, what they've learned and developed, and start bringing it into the field, so that we always should have our antennas out and our feelers out, but to bring things in what we are doing, not necessarily for us to then kind of go off on a tangent and become an artist. Yes, that could happen, but I think it would be a waste. So you see, if somebody who has been raised and studied and is really part of our discourse, living and breathing it, somebody like, I mean, I'm not saying he's doing it at all. Somebody like Mark Thorns, for instance, he has the opportunity to become an artist, and then suddenly we'll talk differently, has different values, different agendas, and he will be in a different part discourse. It's not happening to him. I'm just saying it would be a huge waste for us to lose somebody like this, because they're going out and using the art space and the art world to further some of these experiments, and then to bring that back. And of course, it is fully part of the discipline. I'm saying that we should have the clarity of vision of what we are about, and not say, well, all disciplines are interdisciplinary now, all these boundaries have been blurring and we don't know what architectures could be, this could be that, could be anything. I think it's quite wasteful. That's why we have, for instance, biennales, which contributes 0 to the progress of architecture, because they just become anything goes, current affairs, global crises, inspiring installations and slogans, no work shown, even if architects, actually the curators and contributors, but what they're doing there is amateurish, installation art mostly, and contributes absolutely nothing to the discipline. So whatever that effort is wasted. Or if you look at the schools of architecture, largely in many places now, they don't know anymore. The students of architecture are encouraged to become, they compete with political movements, political parties, think tanks, NGOs. They substitute themselves for governments, what governments they think should do, and they're taking on weight. They're taking on the big problems. I've been talking about big issues and problems, but I'm focusing on architects and architecture's contribution to them, and not just kind of getting lost in the big problems without having a location, an expertise, and an angle, with a specific competency and let's say on that. And so that's the risk I see, that this kind of discipline in the schools of architecture, they're kind of dissolving, and the disciplinary demarcation will be very healthy, because there's talking shops, and they become also like art schools, where so you get a lot of artistic responses to political crises kind of things going on. I mean, I may be exaggerating, but I've been seeing it in many schools. It's highly unproductive, I think, and highly wasteful of so that means that architecture doesn't benefit from all this time, energy, and money.
Yeah, I totally agree. I very agree. I have to say, I have a lot of discussion. I can go on forever with you with this topic, educations, all these cultures and everything. But I think if I'm not wrong, time is already almost up. So I have to hand over back to Philip and Yen. So yeah, it's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to you, Patrick. But who knows, maybe next time we can talk over a drink, virtual drink, or maybe hopefully offline.
Yes, I think virtual drinks have yet to be invented.
Virtual talks. Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you.
Okay, good. Are we closing here?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think looking forward for tomorrow lecture. Tomorrow is really interesting.
Okay, yeah, tomorrow I'm going to talk about styles, theory of styles.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Maybe interesting discussion tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.